Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 26. Still, given the amount of attention and awareness the asset had given to the children growing within him, Pierce was understandably nervous when it comes time to employ the asset's services once more. Pierce holds out the picture, keeping all expression off his face. "This is your target, Soldat," he says. The asset merely inclines his head, his face as expressionless and his eyes just as empty as they were before the disturbance. "Sir," Jarvis was saying. Tony startled, dropped the welding torch, thankfully before he managed to burn himself, and pushed up his welding mask. "Sir," Jarvis repeated, "I believe you should see this." Tony frowned and blinked several times to refocus his eyes. It took a moment before everything more than a foot or two away became more than a strange foggy blur his eyes couldn't quite seem to penetrate. Jarvis had turned on the TV and projected it onto the nearest wall, and after a few more blinks, Tony could make out medieval-looking buildings and then a headline screaming, "Greenwich, London, England." And then the words faded right back into non-importance. Tony's eyes caught on the spacecraft. The people who were screaming and fleeing, the car pileups, the spacecraft. It was stuck in the earth like a hovering, lumbering, black monolith towering over all the nearby buildings, power flickering anomalous red. Tony's breath caught in his throat. Very consciously, he sucked it the rest of the way in, then let it back out slowly. He gripped the nearest workbench. Relief flooded over him when he knew for sure that his hands weren't shaking. Couldn't, not with his own harsh grip on that unyielding surface grounding them. Somewhere in the background, a reporter was damn near screaming something or other, but Tony couldn't make it out. All he heard was noise. The spacecraft opened and aliens walked out. Tony's heart skipped at least half a dozen beats. They weren't Chitauri, he could tell that at a glance. They weren't Chitauri, but they were still not human, and nothing about them screamed, "We come in peace." Tony's stomach clenched with a strange icy cold. Very carefully, he forced another mouthful of air into his lungs. "Jarvis," he said, "do we have an armor ready for launch?" "Sir," Jarvis said, "may I remind you that you were on leave from the Avengers Initiative, Master James." Tony swallowed, felt the conflict tear through him. Go out there and protect the world. Protect Jamie and his world. Or stay here, play the civilian, help his son feel safe, even if it was all an illusion. "Where is Jamie?" he asked. "Can you give me a visual?" Jarvis split the screen in two, and for a moment Tony could pretend that the left-hand half and the utter mess that was London City didn't exist, could focus his whole attention on the right-hand side. And there was Jamie, just a few handful of levels down in the preschool, grinning toothily. His hands were brown with clay. In front of him was a slightly lopsided but still very impressive model of Stark Tower. In some ways it was obvious it was a child's work. It was crooked and the edges uneven, but the attention to detail was astounding. The tiny windows and doors were incredible, the recollection as well as the execution, far beyond what could be expected of a child Jamie's age. Then again, Tony reminded himself. He felt his breath start to come smoother and easier, no longer a struggle every bit of the way. Jamie was almost exactly the age Tony had been when he'd built his first functional circuit board and accidentally revolutionized the world of computers for the first time. It was frightening on the one hand to see Jamie display the same feats of recollection, innovation. Some details were changed to fit Jamie's own fancies, and motor control that Tony had at that same too young age. But on the other hand, Tony couldn't help but feel proud, too. And prouder, somehow, for knowing that Jamie was creating his own little wonders in a safe, secure environment. It wouldn't be turned into a publicity stunt or a new patent. Tony would never dream of allowing that. Jamie would get to enjoy his accomplishments with the people who mattered without the rest of the world watching, waiting to devour him. "Sir," Jarvis prompted, "Master James is safe. He displays signs of joy and pride, high levels of dopamine, and none of adrenaline or cortisol. No physical markers of stress or fear whatsoever. He is having a very good day." Gods, when had Jarvis decided to become an expert in neuropsychology or whatever that even was? Nonetheless, Tony managed to smile at that, felt relief rush through him, and a faint kind of almost echoed joy. But even that only lasted so long. Knowing Jamie was safe calmed him for the moment, but it also scattered his attention. Suddenly he was seeing the left-hand side of the impromptu screen again, even if only out of the corner of his eye. And then with a start, all his attention was on that side of the wall. His lungs clenched tight. He could not breathe. He thought his heart stopped in his chest. He was cold. Cold. Cold, 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 cold. He could not breathe. Terror gripped him and clenched him to its frigid core. His hands shook where he clenched the edge of the workbench. His vision blacked out for a moment. Then it came back into all too sharp focus, blurred again, then focused mercilessly. His knees trembled beneath him. Wormholes, or something like it. More and more of them appearing. People stepping into nothing and coming out of nowhere. He thought he saw Thor in there somewhere, which should be reassuring, should tell him it was all safe. But Thor was all alone, and Thor was appearing and reappearing. Buildings crashed and vanished. People screamed. More cars piled up. Thor vanished. Thor appeared once more. Thor was all alone. Tony's knees buckled. His chest hurt from lack of air. He tried to suck in a breath, failed, tried again, failed once more. He tried again, drawing in every bit of strength he had, willing to trade it for just a sip of air. A little bit came in on a gasp, like breathing through wet cloth, and suddenly part of his mind was back in the Afghani desert. He had a car battery in his chest. Rough hands were shoving at him, forcing his face into rancid-tasting water. Shocks coursed through his body when the water hit the exposed circuits. Pain burnt through him. Numbers flashed before his eyes. 15% toxicity, then 25%, then more and more and more. Tony could only watch the numbers grow. A phantom wail assaulted his ears. Jamie. Jamie would grow up without him, and Tony wouldn't have been there for him. He would be a disappointment, as much a failure as Howard had been. More. Even as Tony listened, the wails grew more and more distant. Tony sucked in another sharp, insufficient breath. He felt lightheaded. Desert heat beat down on him again. The taste of rancid water filled his mouth. Sparks of pain assaulted his nervous system, flashing up and down his spine. He forced another breath into his mouth, down his throat, into his lungs, like breathing through the world's skinniest straw. Big man in a suit of armor, Howard's voice said. Jamie's voice said, "Take that away, and what are you?" Tony opened his eyes wide, tried to face this threat head on, this threat that he at least knew he could face. He opened his eyes and he saw Thor being sucked into a wormhole. For a moment, Tony's heart seemed to stop. His chest hurt. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes once more, all he saw was space. Black emptiness and distant stars and Chitauri warships, hundreds upon hundreds of them, further than Tony could see, more than he could ever hope to count. His mouth opened around a scream that would have no sound. There was no sound in space, after all, only empty, cold, isolated darkness, and this was how Tony was going to die. This was how the world was going to die, how Jamie was going to die. And then Jamie was dying. He was strapped down on a hard operating table. Fire licked at his skin, but the flame was very visible, no more than a shadow beneath his skin. Tony saw his face contorting, saw the pain breaking down his clever, beautiful little boy, and this hurt like none of the rest had. This rent him to pieces, cut away all the strings keeping him up, keeping him together. As if from far away, Tony was vaguely aware of his legs giving way, his knees buckling, his mind blacking out for a moment. From a world away, he felt cold metal flooring beneath his cheek, felt the throbbing of a head injury. A wormhole flashed across his vision, promising the end of all things, the world, hope, everything he had ever held dear. Jamie! Tony tried to breathe. He wasn't sure he managed. Jamie was still in front of him on the operating table, burning from the inside. Tony ran as fast as he could. Everywhere he went, black hands reached out and gripped at him, scratching and clutching, holding him tight, trying to prevent him from reaching Jamie, his son, the one thing he couldn't stand to lose, couldn't live without. Tony screamed, struggled onwards. He never seemed to get any closer. He still ran through water and molasses and hardening asphalt, struggled against hands and arms and grips much stronger than he was. He was sobbing by now, as much as he could when he could hardly breathe. Jamie's hand caught fire, that precious, perfect little hand which had just been covered in clay, busy creating. There one moment and ash the next. Panic gripped Tony and shook him like a dog with a toy. He screamed and screamed and screamed and tried to struggle onwards as more and more of his baby boy caught fire, evaporated before his eyes. "Daddy!" Jamie called. "Daddy! Daddy! Daddy!" Tony screamed and sobbed and tried to tell his baby he'd get there, but the words turned to ash on his tongue. He couldn't get the breath to try again. "Daddy, please!" Jamie called. Tony curled in on himself as he watched the last bits of his baby boy burn into nothingness, leaving him cold and empty and so alone. Distantly, he felt cold metal against his cheek. Dimly, he felt himself gasping for air, felt his lungs struggling and fighting against themselves. Faintly, he sensed his own racing, pounding heart, the way it could barely keep up with its own pace. He felt cold, so empty, so... Someone touched him, and Tony screamed, head full of languages he couldn't understand, and hostile hands pushing his head under that filthy, filthy water. Someone sobbed. Maybe it was Tony. It was not, he realized, after a half a dozen desperate, uneven, insufficient gasps of air. He tried to blink his eyes open. but all he could see was a blur of color and shapes. He squeezed them shut again. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what he'd see if he opened them anyway. The 10 rings in the Afghani desert, or the numbers counting down to his death by the thing keeping him alive, or the wormhole in the army sure to wipe out them all, or Jamie, dead, dead, dead because Tony wasn't strong enough to protect him. "Daddy!" That sounded like a sob too, but Tony couldn't trust it, couldn't be sure. Hadn't he just seen Jamie burn up right before his eyes? "Daddy, please, don't be scared!" It still sounded like a sob, but it did sound like Jamie, and not quite like dying. "Daddy, please! I love you, and I'll protect you! Just breathe, Daddy! Please be all right!" Another sob. "Daddy, please!" Tony's whole being clenched in pain at those words, at the sobs and the tone of desperation in that dear little voice. With all his might, he felt himself swimming towards some kind of metaphorical surface, struggling with all he had against all the currents fighting to drag him down. "Daddy!" Jamie said again, and Tony sucked in a sharp breath, seemed to actually get some proper air this time. Slowly, still gasping and panting, he forced his eyes open. And there was Jamie. He was alive and whole, and Tony wanted nothing more than to pat him down to confirm that hypothesis. He wanted nothing more than to sit up straight and gather Jamie into his arms and hold him close and never let go. He tried to sit up. He couldn't. Weakness suffused his whole body. He could barely move a finger, could barely find the strength to draw in his next breath. Jamie was sobbing, his whole tiny body shaking with it, his small little fingers carding through Tony's hair, while his other hand patted almost desperately at Tony's chest. "Daddy!" Jamie sobbed, his whole face crumbling before he sank down onto the floor next to Tony, folding himself as tightly against Tony's heaving, struggling chest as he had when he was just a baby. His small hands clawed at Tony's body, fingers and small little nails digging into Tony's skin, almost painful. Tony didn't even have the strength to wrap his arms around his son's trembling body in turn. When Bruce rushed in and gathered Jamie into his arms, it was the first time since his return from Afghanistan Tony had been grateful to see someone else comfort Jamie rather than do it himself.